This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Hello and welcome to the Hindu's In Focus podcast. I am Nivedita. This year's Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences went to three economists, Daron Acemoglu, Simon Johnson and James Robinson, who have written exhaustively on how good institutions play a critical role in a country's prosperity. In their hypothesis, they explain the role of colonization in making these societal institutions and the role these institutions played in shaping the economy. However, their work has come under sharp criticism from several quarters for ignoring the effect colonization had on colonized countries and how many of these countries are still reeling under the effects of colonization. To help us understand the issue better, I have with me Dr. Surabhi Kesar, a senior lecturer at the Department of Economics at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. Hello and welcome to the podcast, Dr. Kesar.
Thank you so much for having me.
Dr. Kesar, Acemoglu, Johnson and Robinson received the Nobel Prize for Economics for their work on how institutions can shape an economy of a country. What is their hypothesis?
Ashimoglu, Johnson, Robinson, what they refer to as the AJR, they spoke about the institutions and the role of institutions in sort of shaping the long term economic and development trajectory of a country. In economics, they're sort of seen as very important and influential scholars in what is called the new institutional economics. And one of the key arguments stemming from some of the key works is this distinguishing between what are called the extractive and the inclusive institutions. And what they argue is that colonialism, when it happened, resulted in two different forms. Either it was of the settler colonial kind or the non settler colonial kind, which, according to them, happened exogenously because there was settler colonialism in areas where the mortality rate for the European settlers were lower, while non settler, where the mortality rates were higher. And their understanding is that where the European settlers settled, they developed what were called the more inclusive institutions, and those where they did not settle, they developed what were more the extractive institutions. And these two different kind of institutions tend to have a long-term impact on the economic development trajectory of a country and the living standards, etc. The inclusive institutions, according to them, include property rights, enforcing of contracts, etc., that can facilitate the process of capitalist accumulation or contemporary economic growth in a country.
So overall, the premise doesn't sound bad, right? So an institution that looks at protecting private property, enforcing contracts, and fostering innovation, like you said, all of these will help any nation grow. So what's the issue with their thought, ARJ's thought?
So it's interesting because what they refer to as good institutions, they are good towards a particular process, or they are good for a particular set of people. So in doing so, I think they do not get the dynamics of colonialism or of capitalist development or that of what these institutions can do specifically right. For example, one of the things that with my co-authors Ingrid Kwangraven and Devika that we wrote about recently in Economic and Political Weekly is that they consider colonialism as almost an exogenous shock that produces these two types of institution. However, that in itself is a very flawed understanding because both extractive and inclusive institutions are not simply two distinct institutions. In fact, they're two sides of the same coin, whereby when extractive institutions were being set up in some countries, they in fact aided the so called inclusive institutions in the other countries. So if you think about it, in a lot of countries where settler colonialism didn't happen, there was a lot of extraction and mining, etc., which were in fact aiding those colonies where the European settlers had settled or in the colonizing economies itself, which then has these longer term impacts of development. But the extractive institutions, in some sense, become the basis of inclusive institutions. And the fact that they look at these as two disconnected institutions that happen to emerge because of an exogenous shock shows that there is a lack of understanding of how these institutions are developed. And second thing is about, even when we think about, what you're saying, private property rights and good institutions, etc., there's a lot of literature that contests how we need to be thinking about private property rights, because there's old works of Kanchai Laya and others who basically shown that in fact this administering of strict private property rights in fact led to a re-entrenchment of caste-based inequalities, because land titling system was formalized in a way, and the people who had formal land titles because of access to literacy, which were usually the sort of forward castes in the country, were able to then access all of these and be able to kind of gain ownership to those resources. So, in that sense, both the idea of what are good institutions, as well as the fact that institutions of extractive and inclusive nature can't simply be seen as two disconnected things, are an important aspect of the story that they seem to be missing out on.
So what they're essentially doing is removing politics or the influence of politics from economics. Is that right?
Yes, and it's very interesting that they do so, in fact, in a very perverse manner, because their entire idea is that they bring institutions within economics. But it's often been, what we refer to as economic imperialism. The economists have the way of going and thinking and talking about all these quote unquote non economic aspects from a vantage point of economics, rather than trying to understand what are their own intrinsic dynamics and how they may change and shape the economic processes, so to say.
So in your column which you talked about, you also mentioned that they also had a very European outlook, a Eurocentric outlook. How does that influence their policies and their definition of what a good public institution is?
Okay, interesting question. So I'll just talk about what is Eurocentrism, and in a forthcoming book, again with Ingrid Devika and Carolina Alves, we're trying to kind of unpack this understanding. And for us, usually the idea of economic development is seen to be one where which sort of emerged as if economic development and industrialization emerged in the global north almost endogenously through rationality, technological progress, so on and so forth. And all the other countries of the world in the global south or the developing countries are just expected to follow that same path. However, in this understanding, the role of colonialism, as well as various other processes of racialization, caste based hierarchies, patriarchy, etc., that were resulting in the creation of development on one hand, and simultaneously capitalist underdevelopment on the other hand, was sort of brushed under the carpet. So, if we take into account that these two different stages or different processes of development and underdevelopment were in fact created through a common historical process, we can't simply look at development and underdevelopment as a linear trajectory. Oh, this is something that the countries of the global north did due to technology, industrial development, and we simply have to follow it. That becomes entirely complex because even currently, the world is structured in a very unequal manner, both across global north and south, as well as within the different countries. And in that sense, what happens is when the financial systems are not equal, there's a dollar hegemony in terms of the currency hierarchies that exist, as well as the space for industrial policy that is available to different countries. That really creates an unequal relationship between different countries and do not allow them the same space to so-called undertake development, because for the now developed countries they did have access to different measures or different ways through which power was exerted on various parts of the world. So a view that does not consider this commonality is something that we call Eurocentric, and we think that AJR view is particularly Eurocentric because, as I said, they do not look at both extractive and inclusive institutions or capitalist development and capitalist underdevelopment as coming into being because of a common historic dynamic, rather look at them as two different stages that happen due to these exogenous shocks.
So to me, it looks like the major issue is in defining what a good institution is. Supposing for say for any country, you will have a good institution is an institution that say provides social security benefits. But that's something that's exclusively given in countries which are already rich, and poorer countries, especially the underdeveloped ones or the least developed ones, the people who really need it won't have access to it. So how do they define what a good public institution is?
So, for them, the definition of a good institution is particularly those institutions that facilitate the process of capitalist accumulation. And they could be various kinds, like we discussed the example of private property rights, even democracy, for that matter, are like good institutions. But I think there's one issue in terms of whenever we think about certain institutions as good, and good in terms of their role in facilitating the process of capitalist growth and accumulation, etc., we forget that it's in fact a very differentiating process. By that I mean it's not something that allows um, everyone to gain equally from it. And let's take an example from India, okay? So, for example, the process of development, as has been envisaged more broadly, is one of, we need to promote industrialization and productivity growth in our firms. And once that industrialization and growth in sort of, the modern industries happens, or the services sector happens, people will move out of the traditional sectors, so to say, from agriculture, etc., and get employed in these sort of modern enterprises. And that has been seen as the path of structural transformation. However, we have seen that in India, the growth process has been such that while the resources such as agricultural land, markets, etc., on which these people who derive their livelihoods from these traditional segments, while they have been taken away for industrial development, people have not been absorbed. We are talking about, for the first time in India, graduate unemployment rising to 80%, or people not having access to some sort of sustainable livelihoods, informality in India not going down despite very high economic growth. So, what we are seeing, in fact, is again in a country like India, where there's massive inequality rising, we're seeing some part or some fraction of the people, due to the existence of so called good institutions of private property rights, which we've normalized as something that should be the basis of development. Some people are able to take advantage of that, or rather some classes or groups of people have been able to take advantage of that, while the entire growth process has not been inclusive in a way such that it does absorb all the people who are dispossessed in the process. And when we do not unpack these dynamics of how the growth itself might create these two different dynamics, and in Indian context, there's amazing work by the scholar Kalyan Sanyal, who has talked about these mechanisms where development and underdevelopment are concomitantly produced under the current growth regime. So, there to kind of circle back to your question of whether it's a problem of good institutions, I would say partly yes, of what can be considered a good institution, but also good towards what are we looking at. And for them, the parameter of development would be things like the well-being and the living standards, so on and so forth. So you're absolutely right in pointing out that again, the countries that were able to provide those good institutions is because they were able to access resources and wealth and other by draining other resources from developing countries. But on the other hand, even within the developing countries, we have to see that the dynamics of development can be of the kind that it reproduces underdevelopment. And the moment we see these two happening simultaneously, we move away from an AJR sort of framework where, as if historically, there are these institutions that come into being that just cause these long term development.
So, one issue that could possibly be is just copying what the West did and saying that if it works in one place, it should work everywhere else. So, a place like China, which is doing relatively okay, which has pulled millions of people out of poverty, did not follow the European model of thought. So, how does AJR reconcile that fact with their idea?
Frankly, in terms of AJR's thing, I haven't seen them a response in China because it's very interesting. China and India was India, according to them, was the good institution player, and China, according to them, was the bad institution player. Right, and years later, we are actually in quite a different position in terms of economic growth and development. So I really don't know what AJR's response to that would be, but it's interesting to think about people, in general, if we think about people who worked on East Asian development, etc. In fact, a work by Hajun Chang and others who are basically pointing out that in fact a lot of development policies that the now developed countries did follow, they there have been systematic measures put in place such that the developing countries do not have access to those. For example, in this famous article called Kicking Away the Ladder by Hajun Chang, he points out that the very protectionist sort of trade policies that were followed by the developed countries are in fact something that are not available for the developing country during their phase of development. And that, I think, is again a very interesting way of looking at this unequal role of power. So again, you may have good institutions, but again, who has access uh, to making the gains from those good institutions really matter?
So that's something which is not just there in the colonial era where people of the developing world, the now global south couldn't trade. We didn't have free trade like what the Westerners did. It also applies even now, right? So there are IP protections, there are non-tariff protections, then there are even tariff protections. If, like, for example, Trump's tariff, which not only Trump, like now most of the world is doing that. They're all bringing in all these protective measures to ensure that their country is able to manufacture and their country has some edge over another, or their country and their allies uh, trade better among each other. Not that these policies are per se wrong, but these are not these are not capitalistic by any means. Then, so how do we look at that?
Right. It's a very interesting thing that you point out because it's very interesting how, under different phases of capitalism in different parts of the world, different policies, institutions, etc., were followed. But it's very interesting how, when we are trying to think about it post facto, various things are ascribed the reason for that particular growth, which might not always be the case. And let me start with what you said about intellectual property rights and the difference in terms of ownership. We saw that particularly with the pandemic, right? Like, we saw a time where this development of vaccines, which for the most part happened with government monies in different parts of the country, so basically public spending and taxpayers' money. Despite that, the intellectual property of that was not being shared with the countries of the global south, because private players wanted to make profits out of it. That's a classic example of a private property right, in fact, leading to massive vaccine inequality, which is the fact that we could not vaccinate people very quickly was the reason that we saw this pandemic continuing to grow and take much more violent forms. So those are precisely the kind of things that we have to think about in terms of private property rights and inequality. And also, when you talk about protectionism sort of making a comeback now, and how do we think about it? It's very interesting because when we talk about post World War, and we're talking about 40s to 70s sort of period, in that particular period there are different countries who are, especially the developing countries, given the rise of new politically sovereign countries that come into being, they are thinking about the project of national building, and national building becomes a very important project post the world wars. However, post 70s, we see what is called this rise of globalization and liberalization, where the idea is that capital in of itself, in terms of where you invest, etc., becomes much more global. And that, you can see, also aligns with this phase where there was profits for the countries in the global north. They were looking for more profitable avenues, so the entire global south kind of opens up their borders, and there's more investment coming from the countries in the global north, which becomes the vehicle, or in fact the entire development then becomes about, okay, how can you make your country's institutions quote unquote good or better in order to attract all of these investments that are coming to your country, right? From the national building we move towards a more globalized way of thinking about it. This has very important impacts. First of all, we lose, developing countries lose some autonomy of how to carry on their development project. There is, of course, imposition from the international institutions about how much public spending can happen, and there are basically huge tight bounds inserted on how much public spending that can happen, which makes our development less autonomous. But also on the same side, same on the same hand, what's also happening is that in the global north, the country's labor becomes in some sense much more surplus, because capital is now able to find more profitable avenues elsewhere for production to take place. And this of course leads to some sort of a political discontent within the countries of the global north, because the economic policies are in some way not really aligned with the political priorities. And that's why
And
you see.
sorry, I wouldn't blame them also, right, for being discontent with the work. Like, take the US for example. When every product moved from the US, manufacturing moved from the US to China, of course, the people who are there in the US and who are doing good manufacturing job, they're going to feel bad that their factories closed down. It's not a surprise that they're going to feel bad, right? So that's going to have more wealth inequality within that country also.
I 100% agree with you. I completely agree that it's actually a lose lose situation for labor throughout the world, right? And it's a really bad situation for the people in the global north. And you see that being expressed in terms of the political discontent with the leaders of the global north as well. And that is why the politicians now have to do a U turn where they're like, oh, actually, we want protectionist policy, just because the economic goal of the big capital investment class, and that the political goal of kind of creating a political cohesion had started to break down. In fact, has been breaking down. And post 2008 economic crisis, we sort of saw the worst of that in some way unfolding. And it's very interesting that, when we keep thinking about development simply as one where, more capitalist accumulation without, I'm not against industrialization, just to be sure. We want industrialization, but what I'm talking about is the way economic processes are aligned such that whether they can result into better welfare for everyone, and how is it that we are defining development for people in this context. And to just kind of end that argument, that yes, people are right to be discontented with things like that, but we have to think that in a scenario where capital is global but labor is not, is there at all a possibility or way where we can resolve this question? Because every time capital is able to finds that it's not profitable enough, it can always move to the next venue. You can find cheap labor in China. Once you feel that, oh, that labor is becoming more expensive, you can move to India, you can move to Bangladesh, you can move to Ethiopia, so on and so forth. And we're seeing what's happening in Bangladesh as well in terms of the economic situation. And this sort of inability to resolve this question is something that I think this particular political moment with so many unresolved questions has come to haunt us.
So basically, the entire point here is the a race to the bottom has made economics a very tough thing, especially with AJR. So, or with capitalism as such. If people keep moving their capital from, at least manufacturing, I'll be okay with if they move manufacturing from one place to another. Not that I'm totally happy with it, but a lot of money that it's just invested in stock markets, which literally multiplies money without actual productivity. So those kind of things are not addressed in this, is it?
Right. So exactly, not really, because I guess one of the things is, of course, this huge rise of financialization and finance capital that's happening, and you know institutions are not domestic in nature in some sense, right? And of course there's global power inequality, so some countries will be able to make better use of whatever institutions, both national and global, that they have access to. And even in terms of manufacturing and services, I think we're and AJR's latest work will talk about technological development and so on and so forth. And which is quite interesting now, with, of course, much more capital intensive production coming into being. It's great that we can in fact have more capital intensive production where workers have to work less, but the problem is we have made as a world the idea of more workers working an end to itself. Work is supposed to be a means towards gaining livelihood and a good standard of living. If we are in a world where, with a lot of AI advancement, etc., of course respecting the ecological barrier, we are able to have enough as a society to live and have good standards of life, we all could be doing things that we really enjoy doing, producing great journalistic content, creating more debates, etc., without labor being an end in itself. And that's why we are now left in a position where this entire extra labor that we're left with, or the surplus labor that we're left with, that is unabsorbed in this industrial capitalist segment of the economy, we have to provide some way for the subsistence. And the way development, if we're also talking about the long term trajectory of the development discipline, so to say, with AJR being a part of it, one is always thinking about, okay, how do we solve this labor problem without understanding A, what's the genesis of it, and B, how do we want to resolve it. If this entire labor is surplus for the kind of production that we want, can we think of another way of maintaining providing earnings to people and a better standard of living that's not always just mediated through work? And this is something that we again see in India as well, where what we end up doing is talking about providing small scale loans or some sort of basic income to people. Sure, we need people to have sources of income and livelihood, but usually what we promise is providing these small loans and small income is so little that it barely allows people to live a dignified standard of living, and that becomes more as a fix to govern the people and manage the people rather than a question of development and a better standard of living.
So, thank you. I think we should end the podcast now with this larger question of how can the government address these inequalities not only through the lens of AJR but through entire development economics. And one of the ways that it can't be done is if we ignore various aspects, the society, the politics of that place, and even the kind of labor that we do. So as you were saying, labor can't just be we always talk about the solution for giving employment, having more labor intensive jobs, but manufacturing is now moved to a place where we don't need that much labor. We can't use the 1940s method of having generating employment through manufacturing because most factories don't need that many workers anymore. So how do we address that?
Yeah, okay, so that's a very interesting and a tough question to end on. I think let me say the fact that AJR bring in the idea of institutions in economics is an important step forward, given that economics wasn't dealing with it. Of course, the problem is, however, once that it is brought in the way that AJR do it, it becomes much harder to criticize economics for not including in it, because they include it in a way that is not just insufficient but in fact gets the dynamics wrong, which is what I've sort of been trying to argue. And in that sense, when we're thinking about the role of government and how do we move forward, I think we have to understand how we think about economic development. And much of economic development today is being thought either in terms of the idea being that there's a lack of structural transformation. So this change in economic structure from sort of non-capitalist spaces to more capitalist productive industrial spaces has not happened. So how do we facilitate that shift in structure to happen? Or it is assumed, look, that entire transformation is sort of not an important one right now. There are certain, everyone is sort of undertaken that transformation, of course some more developed than the other. The question is how to align individual characteristics and institutional characteristics, which is where AJR come in order for this process of accumulation to continue. Now, till we center in this entire idea, two things, and in one work with Snehashish Bhattacharya that we are doing for the informal economy in India, we exactly try to draw these out. One, if we think that the growth process of the contemporary kind is of the nature that it continuously produces underdevelopment along with development for certain section of the people, we need to rethink whether this process of economic development under the current constraints is at all a feasible one, is at all one that we have to be striving towards. And that becomes like an economic question to sort of unpack. And the second question, a very important one that economics for the longest time hasn't been dealing with, but has now taken quite a bit of center stage, is to think about different social and political dimensions in terms of what is happening to it across different groups, across classes, income classes of people, across um, genders, across caste, across racial groups, etc. And all of those, how they interact with this process of economic development is, I think, one of the central questions that we need to answer and unpack to figure out where do we need to go from there and how do we go from here. Because we are in fact in a point of what Gramsci would call an interregnum, where the old is dying but the new cannot be born. And to birth that new, I think these are the primary questions that need answering.
That's a hopeful way to end the podcast. Thank you so much, Doctor, for joining me today.
Thanks a lot, Snevitra. This was really fantastic. Thank you for talking to me.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.